You're listening to The Creative Imposter, episode 130. Welcome to The Creative Imposter. I'm Andrea Klunder, your guide on this never-ending exploration of the intersection between who we are and what we create. I mean, never-ending in a good way. This season has been all about not your typical self-care, and it turns out we really needed this topic these past months. Today, I'm sharing a conversation I had in January with the incredible Lori L. Tharps, author, journalist, educator, podcast host, and speaker. Her podcast is, or at least has been up until now, more on that later, My American Meltingpot. And I don't honestly remember how I originally stumbled across her show. Maybe it was on a recommended listening list somewhere, but I adore a series of episodes she released in September and October 2020 called Don't Be Racist. So yes, you might add anti-racism activist to that list of Lori's credentials. And you guessed it. In this conversation, we are talking about anti-racism as self-care. And I'll admit, I even got a little personal and kind of awkward about some of the things on my mind as a proud auntie of 3 little white girls growing up in the suburbs. I hope this conversation with Lori gets you as fired up and inspired as it did me. So you've been busy. It sounds like when I initially reached out to you, it was the end of 2020, and you were on deadline, I believe.
Yes.
Are you able to say what that was?
Yes, I guess I can. I'm so in the mode of I can't tell you what I'm working on, but it's a new year, and the project was actually publicized in quite a few magazines, so it's not hidden, it's not a secret, but I was working with a couple, helping them tell their story. The book is called The Redemption of Bobby Love. So it's a book that's coming out in fall of this year, fall 2021. And it's the story of a man his name is Bobby Love, who escaped prison in North Carolina in 1977. Escaped prison. It was a medium security prison. He fled to New York City, started his life over again, total law-abiding citizen, fell in love, got married, had kids, grew to be an old man, and the FBI came knocking on his door 30 years later and arrested him for escaping prison in 1977. So they came to his door in 2015 and took him back to prison. And so I was working with them to help them write their story. It's an amazing love story. It's an amazing, dare I say, thriller, in the sense that, this man is living, except it's not a thriller. He just lived a very normal life, working man, paying his taxes, doing the things that people do, trying to make a living. So that was the book that I was working on last, and still working on the final edits. But yeah, that was my 2020 big book project.
Have you done this before because I know you seem to navigate different formats of writing. I picked up from the library, and I'm in the midst of reading Kinky Gazpacho, and also Same Family, Different Colors. Is that the name of it?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Very good.
So I'm reading both simultaneously. Okay. One is more memoir-based, and one is more of a research-based nonfiction. Mm-hmm. And then you also write fiction. Mm-hmm. Is it unusual for a writer to be able to be so fluid between these different formats? Because now you're also saying that you're helping someone else tell their story.
It's funny because ever since I was 8 years old, my mother bought me an antique Remington typewriter. And I fell in love with writing with that typewriter. And I just, knew I was going to be a writer. And in my mind, that meant I was going to write, I used to say I was going to write the great American novel. I didn't even know what that meant. I just knew I was going to write the great American novel.
Good.
It was going to be very powerful and important. But as, you grow up, you go to college, and my parents thought it was wonderful that I loved to write. But they were like, but you need a job. Being a writer isn't a job. So I thought, well, being a journalist is a writer with a job. So I went into journalism, and, that's kind of where my career as a professional writer started. And I always say that being a journalist was the best kind of school for learning how to write anything. So I went from, journalism to, my first book was called Hair Story, and it was, I would say, cultural creative nonfiction. It's the history of Black people and their hair from 15th century Africa till modern times. Yeah. Then I wrote my memoir, which is, creative nonfiction. And then I wrote a novel. So it was very much kind of a step-by-step process where it's like, okay, I know how to do this. I know how to tell nonfiction stories. Okay, I can write a whole book. So now I can take my kind of love of fiction and imbue that with my creative nonfiction. And then I'm like, all right, let's do the novel. Let's do it now. So, I mean, is that normal? I don't know. I don't think it's what's normal, right? I mean, I think there's plenty of people like me who can go between genres, but people tend to think I'm a novelist or I'm a journalist or I'm a memoirist even, but I'm a writer. I mean, I aspire to write a children's book one day. Yeah. And I think that's super hard. Like, I've tried to write children's books and failed miserably, but it's still something that I'd like to be able to do.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. Well, I can't wait for that children's book to come out, Lori. So the reason why I reached out to you actually was not because of your writing. So now I'm getting into your writing and reading it and loving it. But prior to that, I first found you through your podcast, My American Meltingpot, and specifically the series that you did at the end of 2020, which is Don't Be Racist, which was a multi-episode series that I'm not sure exactly how I stumbled across it, but I love it. And it was in the beginning of that series, maybe in the first episode, talking about mindset, where the idea of anti-racism work, you presented it in a way of having a mindset that made me think of anti-racism is self-care, where it's not just about helping someone else or doing the right thing, quote unquote. So if I say anti-racism as self-care, what does that make you think of?
Well, it's interesting because, I mean, it means something different if you're Black versus if you're white versus, if you're another ethnic group. But I like that you interpreted that as self-care because, that was the message that I was trying to make, is that if people look at anti-racism work, particularly white people, if they look at it as, well, this is charity work for Black people and brown people, and like, I should just do it because it's the right thing and they need my help, that's not the right mindset to go into this. Because for one, and this is my biggest point, and, where it gets the idea of self-care, is that living in a racist society is dangerous for everybody. And I liken it to like drunk drivers. If you're like, I don't really care if he wants to drunk drive. It doesn't matter to me. I'm not drinking. I'm not going to get in a car accident. It's true. If you're not drunk, are not going to cause a drunk driving accident. But guess what? If there are drunk drivers all over the highway, you have a very high chance of being killed by a drunk driver. Yeah. And if it's not you, could be your loved ones, right? If we live in a racist society where racism causes all of these other societal ills, an increase of violence, an increase of poverty, an increase of inequities, then nobody is safe and nobody is getting the best of society. I mean, if you consider that a large portion of the population isn't able to give their best because they are prohibited from participating fully in society, then everybody is being hurt by that. If you consider that perhaps the person who has the solution for breast cancer, for example, might be in an underperforming school, then the person who you love who just died from breast cancer is being hurt and harmed and not cared for by a society that's not allowing everybody to participate fully. So anti-racism work is not about saving the unfortunate. Anti-racism work is about saving all of us, improving the lives of all of us. And to be honest, I think it's a lot more painful to maintain ugly, negative feelings about a group of people than having an open heart and an open mind to the possibility that that person of color over there who doesn't look like me might have something to offer me, might have a way to make my life better, whether that's something basic, like, maybe they're, could be a great employee at my place where I work, or it could be, being a friend, like a friend that I never knew I wanted or needed. So in that sense, anti-racism work is self-care because you're opening yourself up to a better life and you're making a better life for everybody around you as well. You're creating a safer, calmer, more peaceful environment. And when I think about, the civil unrest, the protests that happened all of this summer because of the murder of George Floyd and other Black and brown men and women,
Yeah.
that to me doesn't feel like self-care. That feels like living in a situation that is very stressful. And you can't say, oh, that doesn't affect me. Of course it does.
Yeah.
It affects everybody who lives and breathes in this country and globally, actually. So it's incumbent upon everybody to do something so that we don't live in a society that is governed more by senseless hate, senseless segregation, than a kind of peaceful coexistence between people who look different from yourself.
You did in your podcast series dig a little bit into the concept of, you called it decolonizing your mind. And even though it's not a long, lengthy episode, it's very short and to the point, but it does look into our perception of history. And, I was thinking about how in school you learned history in a certain way and it was printed in a book. And so it was like, obviously this is what happened. Obviously this is fact. And then you take a test on it and it's like, it's not until much later that you start to question what you're being taught or what you're being told. When you describe the benefits of being in an anti-racist society and being an anti-racist versus being in this mode of senseless hatred for someone who's in a different ethnic group, how much have you dug into the history of like, why are we still in this day and age in this situation? Why aren't we already in an anti-racist society?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty basic because racism was created to keep certain people in power and to keep the wealth and resources in the hands of certain people. I mean, that should be neither surprising or shocking.
Yeah.
There was a genocide on the native people who lived here first because the white Europeans who came here wanted the land to exploit themselves. First, it was like, yeah, we can share. And then it was like, look at how wealthy we're getting. Why don't we just get rid of them altogether so we can have all the land? And the only way to legitimize killing an entire group of people and stealing their land was by inventing some system that would justify that kind of behavior. And the only way to do that was to classify Native people as inferior, and not just inferior, because like theoretically as a dog is an inferior being to a human, but we don't abuse them. We don't kill them. So not only are they inferior, they're somehow negatively imbued, right? So they're savages, right? Yeah. And so racism is a story. It's an invented story that justifies cruel and illegal behavior. And then it was about Africans who were kidnapped from their homeland and forced into slavery. Once again, that racism story worked. Why don't we create a story around what Blackness is? And therefore, we can justify the cruel and inhumane treatment that enriches our pockets and allows us to like turn a blind eye to the atrocities that we are putting on these people. And so why hasn't that gone away? Because white people still enjoy the privilege of their wealth and their power. And, if we were in a country where, let's say, brown people were in power, you can look anywhere in the world. It's very unlikely that the people in power are going to say, you know what, let's share. I have an idea. We should stop being awful and give half of our wealth away, apologize, and see what happens. Now, the reality is that actually can happen, and it doesn't mean you have to give your wealth away. It doesn't even mean that. It means you just have to take the walls down, stop the army, if you will, the violence that happens when people try to get ahead. And that's what I was saying before, is that allowing other people to have a chance to be their best selves, to contribute, to participate, to self-actualize to the best of their ability it's really only going to make more money for everybody. It's going to make everything more productive. I mean, all of the studies show that diversity improves productivity. That's a given. I mean, you just think like, if all these men who are overrepresented, Black and brown men in prison, were actually contributing members of society, they'd be buying your goods and services, right? They'd be employees in your businesses, making you more money or making themselves more money, but just creating more productivity in society. How in the world is it beneficial to anybody to keep so many people underperforming? It's like anybody who's in business 101 like understands that keeping your workforce underperforming makes no sense.
Right.
So that idea, like why we haven't overcome this yet is simply because these people didn't learn the lesson in kindergarten that you should just share, that there's enough for everybody. We literally are working, and it's understandable. There's a huge element of fear because the lie, the story that was told was so atrocious that you've got to figure that there's some sense of guilt, shame, and fear that like, if we admit that we did these terrible things to get where we are, they're going to kill us. The Black people will kill us. The brown people will kill us. The Asian people will kill us. The Native people will kill us. And they'd be okay. That technically they should. I mean, if you go back, right? So I think it's just straight up fear, like fear because look at how badly we have treated you for generations, but also this is scarcity mindset of like, well, if we open up the doors, they're going to take everything, as opposed to, again, look at the principles of economics. If you actually open the doors and let more people do their best thing, everybody wins.
Yeah. Here comes your mid-episode stretch break, and I want you to find your toes. That's it. Whether you're sitting or standing or lying down right now, bring your fingers to your toes any way you can. Maybe you'll even bring your toes to your fingers. Take a deep breath in and out. And now uncurl, unfurl, stretch your arms and legs out in all directions. Take up as much space as you can. Spread your fingers, spread your toes, open your mouth, stick out your tongue. Now relax. Shake your hands, shake your feet, and now tap. Tap your legs, tap your arms, your belly, your chest, your face, your head, and stop. Deep breath in and out. I know you feel better now. If you're loving this episode with Lori, check out my other show, Podcast Envy, where I will be sharing a follow-up episode, getting even deeper into her show and my musings on the life cycle of a podcast. And if you love conversations about creativity, process, and identity, I'd like to invite you to join the Creative Imposter Collective on Mighty Networks, where we host weekly community Zoom sessions designed to do just that. It's free to join at thecreativeimposter.com/community. And if you'd love to hear some of my more intimate thoughts and stories about creativity and identity, consider subscribing to my private podcast feed over on Patreon for $3, $9, or $21 per month, where I'm sharing some behind-the-scenes episodes of what's going on for this creative imposter around yoga, voice, and culture. Hint, I'm not teaching any yoga classes right now. The links for the private podcast on Patreon and the collective and how to follow our guest, Lori L. Tharps, are all in the show notes in the episode description in your listening app and at thecreativeimposter.com. Something that I love about you is that, obviously we've just met, but I feel like I know you because I've been listening to your podcast.
That's what podcasts are great for, right?
Exactly. You do not mince words. Like, you are very direct with your message and the way that you say things and the way that you describe things. And I think that one thing is when we look at like the big systemic problems, the history, the layers upon layers of stuff, it's easy to get overwhelmed and to think that if I want to be an anti-racist, like this word seems it seems strong. It seems like I have to take to the streets and protest. Like I have to be a quote unquote activist I have to put my life on the line, whatever it is. And I know that you offered some different ways of thinking about how we can incorporate it into our lives that may look like that, but also may not look exactly like that. What are some steps that we can take to not get caught up in the the problem's too big, there's nothing I can do?
I'm really glad you asked that question because, my biggest message is that being an anti-racist doesn't have to be hard. In fact, like I said before, I think being a racist is hard. I mean, that's got to be hard to remember to be evil and mean and hide your purse all the time and all these things that, and it must just feel scary. It's got to feel stressful, worrying and thinking the worst of people all the time. That feels painful. That just makes my shoulders hunch up right away. So being an anti-racist, I don't want to say it's easy because, like I said, the first thing is mindset change. And mindset change is hard. I mean, it's an easy thing to say, but it's really hard to tell yourself, totally change the way you've been thinking for the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years. But the first step is to simply tell yourself, just like you tell yourself that eating broccoli is good for you, even if you don't like broccoli, or if you started jogging or doing yoga or anything that you started doing, even though you don't like it, it doesn't come naturally to you, you can convince yourself. The doctor said you can't eat so much salt. So you stop, you get Mrs. Dash, right? And you tell yourself that Mrs. Dash, the fake spices that taste delicious, even though you know it doesn't. But after a while, you're like, yeah, I love Mrs. Dash. It's delicious. I don't even miss salt. So it can be done. I mean, that's the first thing, is to recognize that you have to change your mindset, that anti-racism work is not hard, it's not impossible, and it's not going to hurt. That's the first step. The second step then is to recognize, like you said, that being an anti-racist doesn't look like one thing. Just like being racist doesn't look like one thing. I mean, people say, you're racist, you're wearing a hood. That's not what racism looks like. It can look like that. But being an anti-racist can mean, some people, it's I want to go to the streets, I want to make a sign, I want to protest until our voices are heard.
Yeah.
But being an anti-racist can mean going to your children's school and taking a big collection of books with multicultural characters and saying, this has to be in the school library. Your school library is just really lacking in diversity of offerings. So even though our school is 99.9% white, how are we expecting our white children to learn, particularly because there's no other children of color here? How are we supposed to expect them to learn about other children of other cultures if there's nothing to show them? So I am taking it upon myself to incorporate multicultural books into the school library. That doesn't require even there's no antagonism, there's no run into the streets, there's no my life is going to be threatened, because sometimes some things people are scared. Maybe you're introverted and you just don't want to be interacting so much. But that's a simple thing you can do. Another simple thing you can do that is anti-racist is, if you are in a position of hiring at your place of business, is you can say, hey, there's nobody of color in our business. When we hire next, let's make sure we are hiring somebody who doesn't look like us. And that could be a Black person. It could be an Asian person. It could be a Latino person. It could be a person of immigrant heritage. It's really simple. That is being anti-racist. It's saying there's something missing here. Let me see what I can do to fix it. It can be just educating yourself and then taking action in terms of if you do start to read more about, colonial history or white supremacy, the next time you're having a conversation with family members and somebody makes a racist comment or an ill-informed comment, you correct them, right? It can start at your dining room table. You can start by helping your children or your Uncle Bob rethink their thinking, right? We all can do a small part. And if everybody's doing small parts, we will chip away at this very big problem. Being an anti-racist can be something like making sure when you go out to dinner or when you go to a store, when you're buying something online, that you are supporting store owners or business owners that are owned by people of color. It's literally spreading the wealth. You may not even think about how the fact that you only shop at Amazon is hurting the small businessman or woman of color, even more so than the white businessman or businesswoman, because there's been such systemic racism that does not like offer business loans to people of color. So if they run out of money, there's nothing to fall back on. The bank isn't going to help them like they might help a white person. And again, you don't have to buy into or understand. You just have to realize that there's just such a smaller safety net for people of color who have small businesses, for example. So what you can do is say, hey, tonight when we go for dinner, let's go get dinner from the immigrant Mexican family that we know is, has this great place. Or instead of going to Chipotle, right? Just as an example, right? So something that simple, like you're going to eat, you want tacos. So go get the tacos from the independent, person who you're actually helping. So let your dollars talk, let your power talk. If you're in a position of power for hiring, for example, something as basic as your school, the school that your children attend, or maybe your children attend a very well-supported private school and they have everything they need. So take your abilities to the public school nearby that doesn't have as much and do something there to help the system, right? Help those who need help. Level the playing field, right? And most importantly, do something that you're already good at. Being an anti-racist doesn't mean going to get a new skill set, right? Because then that feels stressful. If you're a graphic designer, go figure out how you can use your graphic design skills to help an organization that's, doing the work. If you're a good baker, go bake some cookies for some protesters, right? You don't have to go out to the protest. Go make some cookies for the protesters, Figure out what you do well, and then figure out how you can be of service. And if you really can't even think of anything, there are millions of organizations, big ones and small ones. Just call, send an email and say, like, I want to do something. I don't know what I should do. I just want to do something. They'll tell you what they need. And you can, plug into whatever it is that you can offer.
I like that you've given a lot of examples with education and children, because I am not a parent, but I am a proud auntie of 3 little girls. And I know that a lot of people in our audience are either parents or aunts, uncles, whatever, or have small children in their life. I have 3 nieces, 3 years old and like 3 months-ish old. And they currently are living in a suburb of Chicago. I'm in the city. It's very white, very, very white. And I fear for, I'm constantly thinking, like, I grew up in a city in Michigan. I did not grow up in suburbia. And my school was not completely white. It was probably like 60% Black, 30-something% white. And then there was like a small percentage of other. So my experience growing up was very different than what their experience is going to be if they grow up in that very white suburb. And I fear for what that experience is. And I'm constantly thinking, like, I have to save them from suburbia. Like, I have to make sure that they're good humans and that they're not racist, and that, which it's a little bit like, okay, it's not up to me to solve this entire problem. But I do think a lot about what can I do to make sure that they're growing up with their minds right and with their experiences that are not going to lead down that path of white supremacy, basically. What would you say in that scenario?
Well, good for you for being a good auntie. I mean, and to be honest, I think the best thing you can do is expose your nieces, and, whether it's your nieces, your children, whoever the fact is that we still live in a very segregated society. You can live somewhere and never see people who don't look different from you. Right. And that's true whether you're white, Black, Latino, Asian. I mean, I have a girlfriend who grew up in Ohio. She's Black, and her parents, like, she grew up in Shaker Heights, Ohio. Mm-hmm. And she had a very kind of...
Wait, isn't that where Little Fires everywhere? Is that the same? Okay.
Yes. Sorry. Yes. It was supposed, it was a planned community that was supposed to be diverse. And my friend grew up middle class to upper middle class. And so her Black parents would take her down to the inner city and make her spend time with Black people who had much less than she did. And they would sign her up for like camps and things to, so she wasn't like, they weren't like doing a drive-by. They were like, just because these people have less than you doesn't make them any less than you. And so they were just very conscientious about, making sure that their children understood that, let's say, that people had less and more. and that they didn't want them to think of themselves as any better than anybody else and to not feel uncomfortable in situations where there was like a difference of, class grouping, right? And I thought that was really smart of her parents, because basically we all kind of fear what we don't know. And it's natural. It's normal. I mean, if I picked you up and dropped you into, whatever, a town or neighborhood where people were very different from you, you might not react in fear, but you might be uncomfortable. So I think the most important thing that you can do with children when you don't live in a diverse area is expose them as much as you can, and not like, don't take them to a museum and be like, look, the African American Museum. Then it's like, oh, African Americans are kind of things that you see in a museum, right? And they don't associate them with humans like themselves. If it can be, saying, I'm going to, again, send you to camps or programs or organizations where you're going to be exposed to different types of people and interact with them and not be like observing them from afar. That's one thing. Sometimes that's not possible. So the next best thing you can do absolutely is give them books, watch movies, TV shows, which can be very powerful, because if you watch TV shows and movies and read books that are not African American history, but Blackish, if your kids are old enough to watch Blackish, like where they see kind of normalcy, suburban family life of different people, then that's what they should be reading and watching and seeing and being exposed to, so that when they do meet other people, they're like, oh, okay, yeah. I mean, I've seen your kind before eating Cheerios in the morning. So like, I understand that you are just like me, right? It's normalizing difference. It's normalizing the fact that, Jimmy and Johnny over there are just like you, even if they eat with chopsticks, right? So it's exposing them as much as you can, however you can, as often as you can, despite the fact that they may live, surrounded by only people that look like them. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't matter who it is that's exposing them. If your auntie or the teacher at school, because you often hear people like who grew up in some sort of very isolated situation, and you say, but how come you're so open? How come you're so, and it's like, because my parents were really good about, or because I had an aunt who took me on trips. That's how you get those people who, despite the fact that they lived in very isolated or segregated areas, still, seem to be really okay with difference and able to integrate and meet and talk to people who are different without freaking out about it or becoming racist, because they can only assume about others, right? Instead of knowing others through these different ways.
Well, and that's something that, I don't know, maybe this is a deep question for towards the end of the interview, but you've written a lot about your experience in relation to race. You've written about this topic of colorism, which we didn't even really get into on this conversation. And you have a podcast in which you're talking about multiculturalism, you're talking about anti-racism. Do you just sometimes feel like you want to talk about anything else, that you are just so tired of talking about race?
Yes, that's exactly it. I finished 2020 and I was like, I'm done. Like, I want to talk about happy things. And the thing is, like, I made my vision board for 2021, and like joy was one of the big words on it. So I said that I want to be a part of the solution. I want to be an anti-racist activist, but I want to use celebration as a form of protest. And I want to, instead of highlighting the problems, I want to highlight the solutions. I want to show people what's possible by showing them, like, look at this amazing, like, for example, there's a new publisher, a new imprint that's coming out that is going to be all YA romance stories with multicultural characters. Hello.
Oh, yeah.
So amazing. Like, rather than let's have another story about the lack of diversity in literature for young people, why not talk about this Black woman and her Asian husband, who are both very successful writers, are going to start their own imprint where they're commissioning romance novels for young people of color.
Okay, how do we find out about that? What is it called?
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned.
Because I'm hoping to get them on my podcast. But
Perfect.
That's the point. That's the point, is rather, because I feel like that can be just as useful to, again, show people what's possible, which is really how I've lived my life. I lived in a very kind of white environment. I did struggle understanding what it meant to be Black in America because I grew up in Wisconsin. But even still, like, I saw diversity happening, working. Like, my best friend was Japanese and Irish, right? And my friends were of every ethnicity you could imagine. And it worked. And the things that people said, you know, Black people and Korean people are at odds. You know, you saw the Rodney King riots of the 90s in LA. I was like, but my best friends are Korean. So what are you talking about that doesn't work, right? Or that they're at odds, or that there's no love between these groups. And if you look throughout history in this country particularly, there's so many examples of people of different cultures working and loving each other and living alongside one another. And so much of this is in books, right? Nonfiction and fiction. Like, these stories are all written down for us to hear about or to be inspired by. And so that's my jam. Like, let's talk about these stories and get inspired and stop putting all of the light on the bad stuff and put the light on the good stuff. And I don't think that makes me sound naive or Pollyannish or anything to say, let's focus on the good stuff. Because guess what? There are 1,000,000,001 people who will keep talking about the bad stuff. It's there, plenty of it. But there's not enough attention that allows people to say, I didn't know that. Well, then if she's doing that, I could do that, right? I didn't realize there was already a community of, you pick the multicultural whatever doing X, Y, and Z. Well, okay, I could do that in my own neighborhood, or I could do that in our church, or I could do that, whatever. So that's where I am angling my attention for 2021. So hopefully people will be interested and still listen to My American Meltingpot. And I'm not changing the name. I'm not changing the logo. I'm just going to keep talking about it until people just associate it.
It works. It makes sense. And I think, that your audience, I don't know your audience, but I'm guessing that if they've been interested in the content you're creating and they're interested in you, then they'll keep listening.
I hope so. Thank you.
You're welcome. Lori, is there anything else that you want to share with our listeners of The Creative Imposter, who are artists, writers, creators, podcasters, creative business people? Anything else that's coming to your mind that you'd like to leave them with?
I think especially today in 2021, we're still in the throes of a global pandemic. We have lived through so many challenges in this last year. I feel like we all owe it to ourselves to just go after our biggest dreams and follow our passions. And this is not to be morbid or anything, but tomorrow really isn't promised. We've seen that so much this year. And if we have a gift to share with the world, then we should put all of our energies into developing that gift and sharing it. Not because it's going to make us a lot of money necessarily, not because it's the in thing, but because we all have something in us that should be shared, and we should allow ourselves to enjoy the journey of doing that thing that makes us the happiest.
Go after your biggest dreams, follow your passions, and why not check out some of Lori's writing or audio content, or both? You can find links in the show notes, in the episode description, in your app, and at thecreativeimposter.com/130, along with the Creative Imposter Collective on Mighty Networks and my Craft and Culture private podcast on Patreon. Also, big update. Lori is actually retiring the My American Melting Pot podcast. Okay, don't panic. The show's not going anywhere, so you can still catch all of her amazing episodes that we talked about in your favorite podcast app. And even better, this summer, Lori plans to launch a totally new show, a podcast spinoff, if you will, called Melting Pot Stories, celebrating multicultural books and publishing from around the world. To hear more of my conversation with Lori and my thoughts on the life cycle of a podcast, follow Podcast Envy in your favorite podcast app, and make sure you catch Melting Pot Stories when it's ready. Follow Lori on Instagram so you don't miss a thing. This episode was mixed by Edwin Ruiz, show notes by Lisa Witter, theme music by Jovia Armstrong, listening by you. I thank you for being a part of this podcast. And this week, I'm reminding you, don't be racist. Being anti-racist can even be more enjoyable than you may have ever imagined.